Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to the University of Dundee. And on behalf of the Society of Biology, I'd like to say that we are absolutely delighted to see you all here this morning. So the Society of Biology decided probably about a year ago now that with the new curriculum we perhaps should be supporting some of the teachers and some of the students who are going to be studying the new higher biology with the new content. And so we decided that we would invite Professor Tim Benton, who is working in exactly one of these areas that you will now be covering in your new higher and advanced higher. So it gives me real pleasure to welcome Professor Tim Benton from the University of Leeds. Tim has the unenviable title of UK Champion for Global Food. Now, to be a global food champion, that would be quite a title to have on your business card. But what Tim's going to do today is he is going to discuss some of the content that you will find in your new curriculum. So without further ado, we'll just hand over to Tim.
Thanks very much, Jackie. Hello, everybody. It's nice to be here. It's a relatively small group. I don't know what time do you have to leave, rush off? Yeah, so if anyone has any questions or doesn't understand something as I'm going through, just wave your hand and ask. Don't worry about that. And we'll see if there are lots of questions, then I can skip slides and so on. Okay, so I want to talk about food and why food is important and where the challenges are for biology, environmental science, and some of the other things that you might be tackling at school at the moment. And food is important for many, many reasons, and it's not just because it's something that we eat on a daily basis. Currently there are 804 million people who go to bed hungry each night around the world, and that's in a world where there is so many significant issues to do with overproduction of food that I'll talk about later. Having so many people who are hungry is quite a criminal sort of thing, really. This is a graph of food price on this axis, this line over time. And where there's a red vertical line, that's where there has been some riots or civil war in different countries. And you can see that where food prices go up very fast, there is a lot of civil unrest around the world. And one of the reasons why the Arab Spring kicked off and why we are still living with some of the issues around Syria and the Middle East is because of food and issues to do with food prices. Food and access to food influences the way people want to move around the world and migration rates. In this country, in the UK, nearly 1 million people required food handouts last year because they couldn't afford food. And so there are all sorts of issues around access to food and social justice and things like that, poverty. Many people in the UK eat shockingly bad diets from a nutritional and health perspective and end up with lifelong issues to do with ill health because of it. And the food system uses more land than any other industry in the world. It's the biggest employer in the world. It's the biggest polluter. And arguably these days, because of ill health associated with food, it's the biggest killer. So food is not just about farming. Food underpins so many things that are important for governments. And my job is to coordinate across all of these government departments, including Scottish Government, International Development, Department of Health, Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs, Food Safety is covered by the food standards, and some of our research funders, to think about the issues of food, the challenges of food, and where government might need to understand the system better and try and think creatively about the challenges that I'm going to talk through. So, why is food a worry? Food is principally a worry at the moment because the demand for food is growing very fast. So, at the moment, this is the number of people on the planet in the different continents, and in 2050, there will be another third in terms of the human population. So there'll be a third more people that we need to feed, and the biggest area of growth is in sub-Saharan Africa. In Europe, it's the only continent where the number of people is likely to go down. But a third more mouths, a third more people wanting to eat. And then on top of that, as the world gets richer, although we might not feel like it, as the world gets richer, over time, this is income per person in terms of annual salary in dollars. This is the number of calories that people want on a daily basis. And there are very strong patterns that as people get richer, societies get richer, you want to eat more and you want to eat more and differently. And one of the issues is that we kind of think about a Westernized diet, middle class, standard kind of eating, many of us do. But as time goes on, actually most of the world is going to be increasingly like us in terms of having the resources, having the money to eat in the way that we do. By 2050, only 12% of the world's middle class, the world's rich, will live in Europe and North America, as opposed to about 60% now. Whereas by 2050, nearly 70% of the world's middle class will be Asian. So we tend to think in terms of the world becoming more like us, and actually, in due course, that we will become more Asian. But the issue is, as people get richer, they want to eat more, and they want to eat differently. And you can see this from this set of pictures here, which is from a wonderful book which is on the web, which is where a photographer and his sidekick went around the world and took photographs of different families and what they ate. And this is a family in Africa who spend about $1 a week on food. This is a family in Bhutan, Ecuador, China, and Great Britain, spending $253. This was about 5 years ago, so the monetary value is slightly different. But what you can see, clearly, as you go from the world's poorest to the world's richest, you get a difference in the quantity, but also you get a very big difference in the type of food. When you're poor, you tend to eat lots of things that come out of sacks and small amounts, and vegetables, and when you're rich, you eat lots and lots of processed food that come out of packets instead. One of the reasons that richer people want to eat more, demand more in terms of food, is that we tend to eat a lot more meat. And as you'll know, in terms of thinking about ecology and trophic pyramids and things like that, almost everything comes from sunlight converted via photosynthesis into plant biomass. We can eat that. Whereas if we take the plant biomass and feed it to cows and then eat the cows, we lose about 90% of the energy in the that was produced by the plants that we could have eaten. So the more we eat, the more meat we eat, the more we demand things at the bottom of the food chain, primary production, to feed the meat. And now, this is a map of where calories are grown around the world, and where it's green, those calories are eaten by people, and where it's red, those calories are eaten by livestock, by cows. Now, increasingly, the world is producing agricultural products on farming to feed to cows, which we then eat. And so there's an awful lot of loss of energy by this poor conversion. The second reason that richer people might want to eat more or demand more is because we tend to live in cities. And increasingly, by the middle of the century, over 70% of the world will live in cities. At the moment, it's just over 50%. And as you will probably all know, the more you live in cities, the faster your life becomes, the more you're always rushing. You go to supermarkets, you buy a whole lot of stuff, you fit it in the fridge, and you find it a few days later it's gone slimy, and you throw it out. And this urbanisation leads to a whole lot of waste, and I'll come back to it later. On average, in the UK, a third of what is bought in supermarkets is thrown away uneaten, simply because we don't abide by the sell-by dates, or it's excess to requirements, or it's overcooked and it's left on the plate, or other reasons like that. The second reason, so the first reason that food's a worry is because people want to eat more. The second reason is that the world is getting more global And this creates a whole range of different things I'll just talk through quickly. So to illustrate the global nature of the food trade, here is a Kit Kat. Most people, when you think about food, you tend to think about a piece of lamb that's come off the hillside or some wheat that's turned into bread and that's locally produced. But most of what most people eat is food like this. So a Kit Kat, it has sugar that comes from the Caribbean, it has cocoa that comes from West Africa, it has milk and butter that come from the UK, and whey, which is milk protein, comes from New Zealand. It has palm oil that comes from Indonesia, sorry. It has soy that comes from Latin America, Brazil. It has wheat that comes from within 35 miles of the factory, and that's because Roundtree say they like to source locally. It has yeast, which comes from a factory in Europe. It has salt that comes from China. And it has plaster of Paris, stuff that goes on walls, plaster of Paris, which glues the wafers together, gives them a bit of bite when you chew it. That comes from a factory in India. So most of what most people eat, your shop-bought pizza or anything, is likely to have this sort of complex sourcing. And 70% of what you eat, 70% of what you eat will have soy and palm oil in. And either salt or sugar, depending on whether it's sweet or sour, or perhaps both. The uniform world, the fact that everybody's connected around the world through trade, creates a range of problems. This is you don't have to worry about the details. This is effectively a map of the world's diets. Where points are a long way apart, that means they're very different. And where points are close together, it means they're the same or very similar. And each point is a country's diet averaged over a year. And what you can see is that in the 60s, most of the red points are quite well spread out. There's a big circle. And at the end of the last decade, all of the points are coming close together. And what that means is that everybody's diet in the world is changing, but everybody's diet is also becoming more similar. Wherever you go in the world, you can eat Chinese, you can eat pizza, you can eat McDonald's, etc. Everybody's diet is becoming more similar. And now, because of that, nearly 2/3 of the world's calories come from just 3 crops. They come from wheat, from rice, and from maize. And 86% of the world's calories come from these additional crops. And because so much of the world's calories come from so few crops, that leads to this sort of agriculture, where you have huge amounts of spatially the same, uniform land that is covered with the same crop, highly mechanized, and so on. And this creates all sorts of problems. It creates problems in terms of diet, and I'll come back to this later, but it also creates problems in terms of if there is a pest or disease. Imagine a pest evolving that wipes out wheat. If almost 1/3 of the world's calories come from wheat, that leads us to a real problem of saying, well, how do we cope then with so many fewer calories in the system? The third reason why food is a worry is that the world is changing very fast. These are just some pictures from the UK over the last few seasons, and every season we've had for the last decade almost has been unusual in some respect. And the reason it's unusual is because of climate change. And we're currently on course. We are putting so much carbon into the atmosphere, creating global warming, climate change. By the end of this century, so we're 2015 now, there is a good chance that all of you can live to 100. So you will be alive at the end of the century. I won't be, but you will be. This is your problem, not my problem anymore. I'm too old for this. I'm trying to solve it, but this is what you've got to live with. By the end of the century, we're on course for a world that's currently projected to be nearly 5 degrees warmer. This is a map from the Met Office of what the world will be like 4 degrees warmer. And you think 4 degrees warmer? Well, we can wear t-shirts more often in summer, perhaps less snow in winter. But this is 4 degrees averaged across the world, day and night throughout the year. So on average, the oceans will be cooler than the land. So when you start looking at the land, plus 5 degrees, plus 7 degrees, +7, +8 degrees. Different parts of the world will be hotter. So if you take, say, in the middle of the Amazon here, +8 degrees, that's day and night, summer and winter, although the temperature doesn't vary very much in the tropics. When it's hot in a heat wave sort of situation, for some parts of the world, you might be in the middle of the summer 10, 12, 14 degrees hotter than what we experience now. In 2003, in Europe, the hottest summer ever in northwest Europe, the temperature was 3 and a bit degrees above normal, above average. And 70,000 people died, and yields of farming went down by about a third. So that was 3.5 degrees hotter. If you're looking at 7, 8, 9, 10 degrees, it's going to be really, really difficult. You know, cows will have to live in sheds that are air conditioned. Most crops won't grow because biologically, after 3.5 billion years of evolution, there isn't just the genetic variability to grow under extreme temperatures, and so on. So that's going to be a real challenge. The final reason why food is a worry is that we're starting to realize that the pressures on the world are getting quite extreme. So, for example, here is a map of where the world is used for agriculture. Yellow is pasture land, so where cows and sheep graze and so on. Green is where crops are grown. Grey, land that is not currently farmed, is either rainforest or desert. There is very little space to expand into that is not rainforest. So if there is no more land available for agriculture to take on, to expand into, as the population grows, what that means is that the amount of land per person, on average, goes down. So here is a graph. This is the amount of land that's available per person around the world to produce the food that they want. And this is the food that's going up, the demand for food that's going up. So think about it. You're all wearing clothes. Most clothes come from agriculture, cotton and wool and so on. You all want food. Food comes from agriculture. You want water. Water's influenced by agriculture. And yet, in my lifetime, I'm 50 now. In my lifetime, when I was born, there was about 1.7, 1.8 hectares of land that produced the food and the fuel and the fibre I needed. Now it's down to 0.7. That's my share of agricultural land in the world. That's a football pitch. Each one of you effectively has a football pitch of land to produce everything you want. By the time you're my age, that will be down to nearly half a football pitch to produce everything you want. And during that time period, you might want more out of the land than we want now. So that's producing a real challenge. How do we ever get ever more out of the land when there is so little land available? And what we see now, over the last decade or so, since food has started to be a real worry on the global scale, is that this is the amount of land that was used for agriculture. In the 80s and 90s, it became a kind of flat line, as globally we stopped expanding into rainforests and prairies and savannas and so on. But over the last decade, the amount of land that is required for agriculture is expanding again back into rainforests and savannas and so on. This is a picture of a rainforest with an orangutan in. And I was in Indonesia a couple of years ago, and I spoke to the Minister of Trade in Indonesia, and he said he thought it was his job to chop down rainforests and convert it into agricultural land because they made a profit, Indonesia made a profit out of that. Whereas rainforest for them, as a resource, didn't give them any money. And the reason they made a profit out of it is because they could produce food for the Western market, and that is leading to a large-scale loss of biodiversity. And food doesn't just require land, food doesn't just impact upon biodiversity, food also requires water. Whether it is from irrigation or rainwater, or for cows, for drinking, for food processing, for washing, and so on. A single green bean, such as we import from Kenya, a single green bean takes a bucket of water to produce. That's how much the plant needs during its life to produce that. So if you buy a packet of green beans That's 40 buckets of water, if you buy that from Tesco's. And then you put it in your fridge and then you throw it away when it goes slimy. What you have done is taken a bath full of water from a drought-prone country in Africa, used it and thrown it away, in a sense, wasted. This is steak. A kilogram of steak, which I guess would feed a large family if you're hungry and you're rich enough to afford it, a kilogram of steak takes 10 tons of water to produce, between 10 and 11 tons of water. Because through the life of the cow, it's got to eat off the grass, it's got to drink, etc., etc. Food requires a huge amount of water. And actually, at the moment, around the world, agriculture uses 70% of the water that comes out of rivers and out of wells and out of taps. 70%. 20% is used by industry and 10% is used by people in the home. And each person, each one of you, the food that you eat on a daily basis, on average, requires, it says here, 2 tons of water that comes from rainfall, 160 or so litres of water that comes out of taps. Now, when you think about your water use, each person in the country uses about 150 litres in showers and baths and washing and teeth cleaning and toilets and so on. So the amount of water that comes out of taps in your home is less than the amount of water that comes out of taps to produce your food. So when you're thinking about the challenges of water, food is really important. Of the food that you eat that requires water, much of it is imported. And actually, 8 out of the top 10 countries that we in the UK import food from are already drought prone. So what we're doing is we're taking precious water from countries that can't afford to give us the water and using it in the UK. So that's why food is such an issue. That's why food is such a worry, because all of these things are coming together. Climate change is happening, water's becoming less available, land is becoming less available, and biodiversity is suffering around the world, soils are degrading and so on. More people want more food, and looking ahead, it is difficult to imagine how we can achieve that. So if looking ahead, the future of food is as we think it will be now, in terms of how demand is going to go up with those extra third of people on the planet, over the next 35 years to 2050, the world will have to produce more food than it's ever produced in human history. More food than it's ever produced in human history. That's a really big challenge for the world, for biological processes, for farming, and so on. So the issue is, can we do it without wrecking the environment? That's a very big question. So, presumably you're all doing biology. Good. I'm a biologist by training. Biology is a wonderful subject. So I'm going to talk through some of the issues to do with where biology can fit in. So the first challenge for us as biologists is to help produce more in a way that is sustainable. And as you know, everything effectively comes from photosynthesis, the conversion of solar energy into plant biomass. Glucose that is produced by, here's the equation, I'm sure you all know this better than I do, here's the equation, produces glucose, and glucose is converted into energy for plant growth, other sugars for storage in fruits and berries and so on, starch, storage in potatoes, for example, and cellulose and so on into cell walls. So one of the real challenges is how can we manage to make agriculture more productive by improving the biology. And one of the reasons we need to do this is shown by this graph. This is a graph I put together when I was working in Stirling. This is the amount of food you get per tons of food per hectare for Stirling and Stirlingshire over the decades from 1700 through to now. And there are two main periods to this graph. The first is a gradual increase in food production as people got better at plant breeding and agriculture up to the Second World War. Then at the Second World War, this is the same graph that's blown up a bit. Just after the Second World War, there's this huge, steep increase in agricultural production, and this is the second agricultural revolution. And this agricultural revolution has two causes. One is that following the war, when industry put an awful lot of effort into producing ammunition and explosives, that ammunition and explosives are nitrogen-based, and nitrogen-based fertilizers are what we use on the land to produce agriculture. So learning how to produce large amounts of nitrogen during the war allowed us after the war to turn that into chemical fertilizer. And that was one of the reasons that this went up. But the other reason why yields went up is not just the input, but it was because of modern breeding. This is a picture from about 1950 of showing historical yields of wheat, which were these tall. If you see them growing today, wheat in the old days used to be up here. Nowadays, wheat, when it's harvested, is this big. And this dwarfing of wheat was caused by clever plant breeding, and instead of putting all of that energy into producing these very tall stems, the plants could put all of their energy into producing the seeds. But what you're seeing around the world now is that this relatively straightforward increase in wheat yields over the decades is now starting to tail off. And there is a huge challenge for biology. If we have to produce more food over the next 35 years than we've ever produced in human history, how can we make this line carry on going up? So you can see for rice, for wheat, and in some places for maize, this tailing off happen. And so there is an awful lot of effort going on around the world in research labs, including here at the James Hutton Institute and in the university, around how can we make plant biology better in terms of producing more, whether it's increasing the efficiency of photosynthesis, or whether it is creating pest resistance, or whether it is creating drought tolerance. Some of these are using genetic modification techniques, some of them are using other plant biotechnological techniques. But the challenge is there. We need to carry on driving up yields, otherwise there's a problem. But it's not all about technology. The future of food is not just does not just rest on biology, and I have to emphasize that. This is a map from Africa of where there is some good data from farmers, and where it is green on the map, where there are only one or two very little spots, this means that where it's green, the yields that farmers are getting are about half what they could be getting if they were farming using modern techniques. Where it is red, they're only getting 10% of what a UK farmer would get under the same sorts of circumstances. And a lot of this is to do with people in Africa can't access fertilizers. They don't have efficient water management. They don't have efficiency of their pest control and so on. So feeding the future is not just about developing new things in biological labs. It is also using what we've already got in a better way. And there are a lot of science challenges in growing more food. This is a new lab that's in a research institute down in Yorkshire, which is growing things under LED lights. And their idea is that this is going to be suitable for growing food in cities. Very low energy LED lights. And you can tune the LED, and if you have more red in it, the plant grows in a slightly different way. And if you're growing herbs, you get far more. If you're growing basil or something like that, the flavour of basil is much more enhanced when you grow it under some light conditions, red light rather than blue light. And so you could imagine a situation where a lot of your fruit, your vegetables can be grown in cities by using new sorts of technology. This is a robotic weeder that is being trialled at Harper Adams Agricultural College down in England. And at Harper, this thing has got an image analysis. It's got a camera in the front of its nose that goes around. It trundles around, this little robot, trundles around and takes photographs of every plant. And it can recognize 26 species of weed through image analysis. And then once it finds a weed, rather than spraying the whole field, this machine, or at least the theory is, can either zap that weed with a laser or spray a bit of pesticide on that weed by itself. So the future of farming is not going to be exactly the same as today. This is an example of precision agriculture. And there are lots and lots and lots of other things that we can do, including the new genetics I talked about. The second big area of challenge for biology is around making farming more sustainable. And if you think about a piece of agricultural land, here's just a map of a bit of land in England. It produces food, yes, we know that, it's agricultural land. But it also produces water. The rainwater that falls on that land goes through the ground, ends up in rivers, and we end up extracting it and putting it into taps. It also produces some degree of flood defence. So when it rains very hard, because water is stored on the land, it doesn't all necessarily rush down and flood your towns. It goes through the soil slowly and acts as a buffer between rainfall and flooding. Land also provides home for biodiversity, such as a bee, a pollinator, that actually helps produce some of the food in the first place. Land provides places for us to walk and enjoy ourselves and cycle. The look of the landscape has important cultural value. Many people feel deeply attached to their landscape, and many people want to live in the countryside because of some attributes associated with it. It's also the home for biodiversity that matters to people. For those of you who don't know, this is a skylark, a small farming bird, and skylarks throughout UK history have been part of our poems about them, there's music about them. Classic FM's #1 chart topper last year was a piece of music about a skylark. So it has cultural value. Countryside also supplies energy, and it stores carbon, which helps reduce climate change. So the challenge for the future is about, if we have to produce double the amount of food that we currently produce, how can we do it and maintain all of these things that we care about as a society? And just to illustrate that, this is data from DEFRA, which is our Environment and Farming Agency. For a farmer that's putting on an average amount of fertiliser, this is the amount of the cost of the environmental damage that is produced. The total cost through impacting on greenhouse gas emissions, health. A lot of people suffer asthma because there's nitrate in the air and air quality goes down. Impact upon water quality because there's nitrogen in the water. Impact on the recreational fishing industry because the water's not high quality. Impact on biodiversity. All of this sums to £330, and an average farmer at the moment with average prices would get £900. So what a farmer's doing, what the farming industry is doing, is producing quite a lot of food, but creating quite a lot of cost as well. And how can we get that balance better over time so we're not impacting on water quality, which we all pay for, it comes in our water bills. We're not impacting upon the quality of the land and the water. So there is a great need, and this is my particular area of research, there is a great need for finding ways to make agriculture more sustainable. So protecting biodiversity, avoiding water problems, stopping the expansion of agricultural land to cut down rainforests, managing the soils better, and so on. But there's no simple way of doing it. The challenge is that almost everything you do to make farming better reduces the yield, reduces the amount of food that you get out of the land. And where we need so much more food, reducing the amount of food by making protecting the environment better creates a problem. And we haven't solved it. Sorry, I skipped over that. There are many things we can do. One of the things that I'm involved in doing research is using satellites to map the landscape and come up with maps of where biodiversity lives, and then trying to find ways of managing the land in a way that preserves things like the small wasps that kill the bugs, pollinators, and skylarks, and so on. The next challenge for biology is around waste management. As I say here, what we throw away in Europe and North America is about the same that all of Africa below the Sahara grows each year. That's what we throw away off our plates into compost or whatever. About a third of the food grown around the world is not eaten. It is thrown away. It is wasted. If you take an agricultural map of the UK, this is an agricultural map of the UK, where it's green is where land is grazed, where it's brown is where land is used for growing crops. If you take the third of the food that we buy and throw away, and I'll come back to it in a minute, each person in the UK at the moment, on average, overeats by about 20%. The third, 30%, plus 20%, that means half of the agricultural production in the UK is effectively wasted. And that's the equivalent of all of the green land, effectively. If we had a world where we all made sensible consumption decisions and purchasing decisions, we could take half of the land that we currently farm and take it out of production and use that for nature conservation or national parks or amenity and recreational value, a whole range of other things. So the challenge of food is not just about how do we grow more, it is also how do we use what we've grown wisely. And there are a lot of biological challenges in recycling, as I put there, from farm to flush, because a lot of what goes down the toilet has a lot of good value in it in terms of the amount of fertilizer that has gone through the food system. If you think about, one of the important fertilizers is phosphorus, and phosphorus is important biologically because it's in every membrane that goes around every cell, and it's in DNA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Phosphorus is really important, but it comes from rocks. And at the moment, what we do is we dig up rocks in one part of the world, we crush it up and we spread it on fields, and some of it washes into the water. The plants absorb it, we then eat the plants, but we don't absorb all of the phosphorus in the plants, and we flush it into the water too. So we end up digging it up in one part of the world and then spreading it out into the oceans. And there's probably only between 100 and 200 years worth of phosphorus left in the ground, because most of the phosphorus we've now taken out of the ground and put in the oceans. So finding ways to recycle are really important for the future. And there are lots of things that we can do about recycling. Some of them are biological, some of them are smart apps. So an engineer was telling me the other day about a fridge that was in development in one of the major engineering companies, which effectively you put your barcodes across a scanner as you put stuff in the fridge. It tells you what needs to be eaten every day, and then there's a modem in the fridge, a telephone in the fridge, which then also can connect in and order the food for you from Tesco online or whatever, so that actually what the fridge does is tell you each day what's in the fridge, what needs to be eaten, and then just orders the food for delivery. And all you have to do is say, when does that food delivery have to happen? And that would be a much more efficient way of managing our food resources. Lots of fun things like that going on. But biological challenges around how do we store food? How do we breed food or prepare food so that it lasts a long time and we don't get to the point where our lettuce in the bag goes slimy? Now, the final challenge for biology, and this is a biggie, is about changing our diets and making our life more healthy. So, I'm sure many of you will have learnt about diabetes. Diabetes is a disorder where we cannot properly regulate the sugar in our blood. So this is a normal person, this is the amount of sugar in the blood hours after a meal. A normal person, it goes up a little bit after a meal, but is largely homeostatically controlled and relatively flat. With somebody who has diabetes, bang, sugar levels go way up and they never reach a period of flatness. Now, I'm sure you all know this. Diabetes is to do with the way that insulin works to control your blood glucose level. So this is the pancreas, this is your gut, in a normal person, insulin is produced, there's glucose in the blood, and that insulin links up to a receptor in the cell membrane, which turns on glucose channels to get glucose into cells, so it comes out of the blood. So that's a normal person. Two sorts of diabetes. One stops the receptor working, and one stops the glucose transporter working. This is the one that's of huge concern for reasons I'll come back to in a second. But diabetes sounds like it's just trivial. It's about the amount of sugar in your blood. But actually, diabetes is horrendous because it affects all sorts of things around your vision, around the way your blood circulation works. And one of my colleagues had his foot amputated a couple of months ago because he had diabetes and the circulation in his foot shut down. In the UK, this is becoming a real problem. And the reason we're worried about it is because diabetes is related to diet and obesity. Around the world, there are roughly 1 billion people who are starving, and at the same time, there are roughly 3 billion people who are overweight or obese. That balance is wrong, really, in any sensible way, to have 1 billion people starving and 3 billion people who are overweight. But, ethics aside, the reason why being overweight is dangerous is because it is associated with things like diabetes. And this is a nice graph. This is the prevalence of diabetes and kilograms of weight over time. So this is America. The mean body weight is yellow, and the prevalence of diabetes is in red. And as you can see, as body weight goes up, you are much more likely to get diabetes. And this is a problem in the UK, and it's a problem around the whole world. No longer can we say being overweight because you're eating too much is a problem to do with rich countries. There are now more obese people in sub-Saharan Africa than there are malnourished people in sub-Saharan Africa. In the UK, diabetes costs about £1,000 per person per year to treat. Overall, in the UK, diabetes costs about £30 billion. On top of that, if you're obese and overweight, you might increase your risk of cardiovascular disease, heart attacks and stroke and so on. And also, there are a variety of cancers that are associated with poor diet. That sounds a bit kind of up in the clouds. But what that means is that every household, on average, is paying £2,500 per year in taxes to run the National Health Service just to deal with poor consumption decisions, poor eating. And there is a lot of discussion down in Westminster, where I spend most of my time, about the importance of the NHS and how can we fund the NHS. And the reason the NHS is really contested is because her healthcare costs associated with population that is getting bigger, getting more disease because of poor health, poor consumption decisions and so on. So now, around the world, eating badly is the #1 killer. Smoking has largely been dealt with. Eating badly and international wars, eating badly is by far a bigger killer than international wars and terrorism and unrest these days. So part of the solution to the future is not to just keep on growing more food, eating more food, getting sicker, but is to change our diets. Find new diets, new and better food, new ways of treating the diseases that we have created, and all of these are biological problems, and new ways of changing behaviour. So, there is a need for change in the food system. What we want as people, or what your parents want as shoppers buying the family food, is lots of cheap, safe, nutritious food that comes from high welfare standards because we're looking after the cows and the sheep and the chickens well, and that is sustainably produced. But the real challenge of the future is that we cannot have all of these things. It's an impossibility to have cheap, abundant, safe food that is sustainably produced. And around the world, a lot of the decision makers, and I'm involved in things with the UK government, with your government, Scottish government, with the European government, with the G20, which works around the world. There is an awful lot of discussion about, we know the food system is broken, we know we have to fix it, but we just don't have a way out of the problem that we're in at the moment. So, to put it in slightly more straightforward terms, if we carry on the way that we are going now, as I've said, by 2050 we'll have to produce more food over the next 35 years than we've ever produced. If we carry on, by 2050, agriculture will need 120% more water than it currently uses. So that's more water than there is available in the world. We cannot manage that. If we carry on as we are, the agriculture and food production will emit enough carbon into the atmosphere to produce 2 degrees of global warming by itself. Food will produce that global warming. We'll lose almost all of the world's biodiversity. Farming is the biggest threat to global biodiversity. And we will end up with a population where that is the norm on the one hand, and more people will be starving on the other hand. So just to give you an example of this, about diet and what it means. You all know, and I suspect all of your classrooms are fitted with devices where you leave the classroom and no one's in there, lights go off. We all know about turning lights off, well, some of the classroom. We all know about turning lights off. We all know about needing to reduce our energy because of climate change. So here is that map of the world's calories. Green for where they're eaten by humans, red where they go to livestock. I did an analysis last summer, which for the US data, because the US data is available and it's not exactly the same as the UK data. For America, if you take a family of 4, and in the US they drive 2 cars in a family of 4. If you take a family of 4, their 2 cars, driven the average amount, the amount of carbon, so the amount of energy used to drive those 2 cars, the average amount, is slightly less than the amount of energy used to produce the meat for that family. So what that means is, by halving the amount of meat that they eat in a family, that would have the same greenhouse gas savings, the same climate change savings, as getting rid of one of their cars. And if that family went vegetarian, it would have the same greenhouse gas savings as getting rid of both of those cars. And governments around the world are trying to grapple with how we can encourage people to go into a low carbon lifestyle. And very soon, over the next decade or so, the politicians will start really signing up to the fact that actually getting rid of cars is a difficult thing because it really affects your lifestyle. But changing your diet, even by a small amount, can have a very big impact. And from a political perspective, changing your diet will also have a good impact upon your health and the cost of the National Health Service. So you can see that there is a political momentum building up about changing the way we eat to get benefits for the environment and to get benefits for health. So if we're going to go into a low meat world in the future, what are we going to replace it with? Well, we don't need to replace meat with anything because there's an awful lot of protein available in vegetarian food. Soya, for example, is 40% protein. That's why we feed so much of it to cows. We chop down rainforests to grow this to feed to cows because it's a really good protein source. But I was at a meeting the other day where there was a discussion about using insects as a source of protein for humans. Here are 2 examples. Insects can be quite tasty, but somehow I don't see them really catching on quite quickly. And then other examples, and this is a really biological problem. This guy's called Mark Post, who works in Maastricht University on the continent. And this is a stem cell burger. So this is a burger grown in a lab using stem cells. This cost about £300,000, this burger. And from what I understand, it's completely flavourless because it doesn't have the fat and the other things in from the meat that gives it flavour. But you can imagine a situation where, like corn or tofu, that you could produce a meat substitute out of meat cells biology. So we're in a situation where I think, let me go back to this slide. I think we've got ourselves locked into a situation where we have unsustainable production, which produces lots of cheap food, which encourage us to waste, overconsume, and has a high environmental impact, but we expect it to be cheap and available. And I call this the M25 model of food production, in that the M25, the famous orbital motorway around London, no matter how many lanes you put on the M25, it has always got a traffic jam on it. And no matter how much food we produce, we will just end up eating more, throwing more away, creating more environmental damage. So part of the rhetoric for the future, part of the argument for the future, is how do we move from this system to a system where we produce in a sustainable way, we manage the cost of the food better, we eat healthily, we waste less, and we have a much lower environmental impact. And that is the idea of sustainable nutrition. Not sustainable agriculture, sustainable nutrition. So, coming to the end, conclusions. We can grow more food, and we can reduce its environmental impact. Perfectly possible to do. There is no simple solution to doing this. There is no one thing that we can do that will make it better, but we know that biology and psychology for consumer behaviour and environmental science and ecology all must play really important roles into this. But it's unlikely that we can ever produce enough food to fulfill demand, because demand is forever going to grow. So therefore, it's not just a science problem. This is also about how do we and you change attitudes to food so that we can respect the things in the future. Because you genuinely, a child born today is going to live to 100. So 2100 is not a long way off. 2050, 35 years, you'll be my age. 2050 is not a long way off. You don't want to live in a world where there is only enough resources and climate change is so bad that only 5 or 6 billion people can live rather than the 10 billion. Final message. This is a slide which was produced by the US Food Administration just as the United States was entering the First World War. So that was 1917. So 98 years old, this poster is. All of these things are effectively things that are still important today. Food, cook it, buy it with thought, cook it with care. Use less of the important stuff. Buy locally. Serve enough, don't waste it. Use what is left. All of those things are things that I'm saying today. This is a bit of a shame that 100 years on, the same messages are being given. Sometimes that makes me want to cry. Sometimes it's a bit encouraging in the way that the messages stay the same. So, final thought for you lot. This matters. Your future depends on how we relate to the environment and how we relate to our food. Think about it. Eat well. Care about it. Don't waste stuff. If you buy green beans from Kenya and throw it away, all you're doing is disadvantaging people in Kenya. We don't have to do that sort of thing. And get involved. Get involved. I'm a biologist. I'm involved. You've all got your careers ahead of you. I would just urge you to do things, not just to make money, but to do things to make the world a better place. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope we're not too late. If anybody has any questions, just stick up your hand. And if anybody wants copies of the slides or whatever, I think they're going on the SAB website. If you want to get in contact and ask questions after the event, then there's my email.
So all the slides and the video will be available on the website.
Any questions? No? Jackie, you don't have to. We can go and have a cup of coffee.
You quickly dismissed the fact that deaths due to smoking are not really that relevant anymore. So the steps that we're taking to eradicate those deaths, can we take similar steps with food?
Yes. So when I was young, all those years ago, I shared an office with somebody during my PhD who smoked, and we had a daily battle about opening the window and stuff like that. It was one of those childish things. We ended up throwing his ashtrays out the window. And in those days, it was completely unthinkable that we would deal with smoking at a population level. And then what happened was there was 20 or 30 years of people saying we've got to deal with it because it's such an issue. And then there was the King's Cross fire, which was blamed on a cigarette. And after politicians saying, no, we can't deal with it, it's public, you know, it's your personal choice. If you want to smoke, it's your personal choice. After that 30 years, this one event gave a brave politician an opportunity to say, we've got to act now, this is ridiculous, we know it's bad. And then within a week, there was a ban on the underground smoking. Within 3 months, there was a ban on smoking on trains. That went to planes. Now we've got pubs and other areas. So I think the message is, I gave a ministerial briefing in DEFRA a couple of years ago, and we were talking about some of these things, and I was talking about the demand and supply stuff. And when I got to the demand side management, the minister said, no, stop. We'll never go there, because it's your right if you want to eat something and make yourself ill, it's your right to do that. But already the political thinking is changing because the cost of the health service is becoming so frightening that actually encouraging you guys to eat more healthily will save big bills in 20 or 30 years' time. And so there might be some step change event where something happens, food prices go up, that provides the political moment for somebody to be brave and say, we've really got to deal with it. Yeah?
There's two bits of two slides that I've got questions that I think are linked. And one is to do with using waste products as fertilizer so we don't lose nutrition that's still there. And the other was about the car and the cow. So if we were to remove animals from our diets, are there implications or are there other ways that we could use livestock or to better use the waste products in terms of fertility?
Yeah.
And I suppose I'm moving towards different methods of production. I know you said America, so the female system is quite different. So intensive, extensive farming. So I'm going with that question.
Yeah, I wouldn't advise a vegetarian world, because livestock are so important in many places, both for nutrition and for the carbon cycling that comes with the manure. But in the American, most of us overeat according to health guidelines 3 times in terms of meat and protein. So there is an issue there that actually reducing it is better for our health and better for the environment. The issue of recycling from farm to flush, there is an awful lot of energy associated with manure, whether it's human or cow. There's an awful lot of nutrition, and in a sense, both of those are wasted at the moment. Although, you know, some slurry goes on fields, but in many parts of the world there is too much of it in the wrong sorts of places, but you can't transfer it. So there are real challenges here about how do you get the nutrients out and how do you get the carbon out in a way that makes recycling sensible. And one of the ways would be to make arable areas more mixed and make sure that there were still some livestock areas in there instead of having all of the cows on the west side of the country and all of the arable on the east side of the country. Right, I'm very aware you want to go. So anybody who wants to stay behind and ask questions, stay behind and ask questions, but feel free to disappear. It's been nice having an opportunity to come up and see you all. Think about what I've said. If you want any feedback and stuff later on for supporting your lessons, then just drop me a line. Thanks.
Can I just add an extra thank you to Professor Benton for coming up today. He's certainly given us a real thought-provoking talk. I hope that in the short term you'll be thinking about rushing home to the fridge and trying to find those green beans and consume them before they become slimy. And in the longer term, I hope that you'll be thinking about a career in biology to address these kinds of issues. So thank you very much for coming along today, and I think we'd just like to thank Tim in the usual way.
Thank you.